I want to talk about BaOmer a little bit, because that's what's coming. Maybe a drop of a different take on BaOmer than maybe what you thought of until now. There's as follows. Good evening. There's a Pri Chadash that I want to start with. The Pri Chadash in Siman Taf Tzadik Gimel in Archaim. The Pri Chadash has a question. He brings that it's Yedua, that the reason why we celebrate BaOmer, at least in his days it was Yedua, is because of the Yartzeit of Reb Shimon ben Yochai, right? Reb Shimon ben Yochai's Yartzeit is in BaOmer, so we celebrate BaOmer. He asks a very simple question. He says that traditionally Yartzeits are not happy days. Yartzeit's not usually a happy day. It's not a day to make a simcha. That's not the general thing to do. So he says something interesting. He says, the Gemara in Yevamos, he says, brings down a famous thing that Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim all died during the Skufa, and on BaOmer they stopped dying. Then the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Akiva had new Talmidim. So he says it's possible, he wants to suggest, the Pri Chadash says it's possible that the simcha that we're celebrating on BaOmer is not about Reb Shimon ben Yochai's Yartzeit. It's not about the Talmidim stopping to die. It's about celebrating the fact that Rabbi Akiva had new Talmidim. It's the perpetuation of Rabbi Akiva's Torah that we're celebrating. Now I want to expound on that Pri Chadash a little bit, open it up a little bit and discuss it. I want to talk a little bit about Rabbi Akiva's life, a little bit about his Talmidim, his first Talmidim, his second Talmidim. I'll start with an interesting part. It's as follows. The Gemara in Yevamos says that I want to read from this Gemara and then we'll discuss it a little bit in detail. The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva says, Lamad Torah b'yaldusay, Yilmad Torah b'zkenusay. If a person learned Torah when he was young, he should continue learning when he's old. Hayulu Talmidim b'yaldusay, if he had Talmidim when he was young, Yiyulu Talmidim b'zkenusay. He should continue to have Talmidim when he's old. Shenemar, b'boiker zrei zeracha, fine. Amru, they said, Shnayim Asar Elav Zugim Talmidim Hayulu Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 sets of Talmidim. Migivas Adan Tifrus, V'kulan Mesiv V'Parakachad. They all died during one part of the year. Because they didn't treat each other with respect. The world was desolate and totally broken. Until Rabbi Akiva came to the Rabbanim in the Darim, and he taught them. And who are they? Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, Reb Yosef, Reb Yosi, Reb Shimon, Reb Elazar ben Shamua. Hamidu Torah. They're the ones who returned Torah back to Klal Yisrael. So Isa Shah, what time of year was that? Tana Kula Mesim Pesach Vadatzeres. They all died between Pesach until Shavuos time. Okay, this is the basic Gemara. One more detail. The Gemara says, Kula Mesa Misa Ra. They all died a very bad death. Maihi, Rav Nachman Askara. They died Askara, which is some sort of asthmatic, choking death that they died. Okay, this is a Bakanta Gemara. Everybody knows the Gemara. I just wanted to anchor it down, what we're going to be discussing. Now, if you read this Gemara K'pshutai, it sounds like Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim were nichshel in an Indian of Midas. But they didn't have good Midas, whatever that means. On their level, they didn't treat each other with enough respect. Now, about 200 years ago, a whole new theory in why Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim died was invented. I think it's a theory that didn't start from the evidence. It started from wanting to believe this thing, and then the evidence followed. But there was a theory that developed as follows. That said like this. We'll talk about this a little bit as we open this up. But Rabbi Akiva was very close with Bar Kochva. The Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us this. The Rambam tells us in more detail. And we'll build this whole thing up. But Rabbi Akiva was very close with Bar Kochva. Bar Kochva was the famous revolt after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, about depending on maybe 50-something years after. The Gemara says 52 years. We're not sure if that means the starting point, the end point. So in the 50-ish year range after the Beis HaMikdash, Shimon Bar Kochva or Bar Kuziva started a revolt against the Romans, which ultimately he gets smashed completely. And today, the estimation based on Midrashim and Chazals and secular history books is that somewhere between 500 and 600,000 Jews were killed during that short period, of the revolt of Bar Kochva. A tremendous amount of dead.
Is that the most second Holocaust?
Probably the Churban was more, depending on if you look at all the Midrashim, whatever. But it's a crazy number. That's a tremendous number. And even worse so, they were not allowed to be buried. The bodies piled up for some amount of time. Then eventually they were allowed to be buried. It's a whole story for itself. Now Rabbi Akiva was very close to Bar Kochva. There's many Chazals, and we'll deal with them in a second. So came along, I guess he was a maskil, but a Talmud Chacham, by the name of Rav Nachman Krachmal. He went by Rav Nachman Krachmal. And he said like this. He said, Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim that died, disregard what the Gemara in Yevamos says. They didn't die because they had bad midas. They died, they were all soldiers. Rabbi Akiva was a general in Bar Kochva's army. Rabbi Akiva was a 2-star general in Bar Kochva's army. He had a whole platoon of soldiers that equaled 24,000 soldiers. And Leinagu Kavod Zeh means the unit cohesion broke down. They weren't able to communicate properly. The unit cohesion broke down. And therefore, they all died in battle. During that same tkufa with the Bar Kocha's revolt, they all died. And this is Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim that died. Talmidim is loosely Talmidim, and they died during, this was his idea. Now, he had this idea. He had a few rayas. We'll talk about them in a second. And slowly but surely, the idea caught on. It made it into dozens of svarim after that. When the Zionist enterprise really kicked up in earnest, and the idea of le'umiyut, like of nationhood and pride in our soldiers and whatever, became a thing, so this became a very, very popular interpretation of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. And in that world, they believe that Rabbi Akiva, this Gemara Nivamis, Rabbi Akiva was a Hesder yeshiva. Rabbi Akiva had the largest Hesder yeshiva ever, and unfortunately they all perished in battle. And, on Har Herzl, there should be a maskeret for Rabbi Akiva's Hesder Yeshiva. That is what became like a whole theory. And it's brought down in, dozens of svarim today by even some serious Talmidei Chachamim, who came around to this theory, and there's different rayas, ahina, hair, whatever. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the rayas, the not raya is very simple. It's really connected to Gemara. Meaning the Gemara is not very vague about it. The Gemara is pretty specific. The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 peers of Talmidim. They all died because they naglu kavod zeh. It was during a specific tkufa. Klal Yisrael, as a matter of fact, it's not some obscure Gemara that faded into obscurity and now we're rediscovering it and trying to add layers to it. Klal Yisrael seem to have taken this Gemara very literally and observed Sfira. Sfira is brought down in the Paiskim for over 1,000 years. We have no reason to presume that it wasn't, in effect, much longer than that before Sifrei Psak were written. So, from a very straightforward perspective, it's like you're arguing in pretty much a straightforward Gemara that wasn't like an Agadah to Gemara, a Gemara that was enacted into halacha in a very practical way. It's very hard to move from something like that. But here's the rayas that they had. The first raya that he had was from something called the Igeras of Shri Regain. Shri Regain is from the last Gainim. He wrote an Igeras, which is basically, it's a history of Klal Yisrael. That's what the Igeras is about. It's about Mesiris HaTorah, but it's a history of Klal Yisrael. And when he gets up to Rabbi Akiva, he says, Rabbi Akiva, Hayu Loi, Shtayim Asel of Zugas Talmidim. He had 12,000, sets of Talmidim. Umesu b'shmada. They died in a shmad during the tkufa of that time. Kulam ben Pesach la'atzeres. Now, shmada, according to some, means government persecution. Now, why would we refer to it as government persecution if they died, just kavod zeh? Said, I found over here in the car that they didn't die from natural causes because of their bad midas. They died because they were because they were involved in the battle with Bar Kochva and the revolt against the Romans. They were killed in a military situation. This was the Igeras of Shirgan. Now the problem is that first of all, Shmada really generally in Gemara Lashon, Shmad always means ruchniistic, a challenge. Shmad you would call if the Romans said no Mila, no Shabbos, no. Shmad is not what you call when you're in a battle, a physical battle, with tanks. Now what he says is that the reason why it was referred to as Shmada is because the source of the battle was religious. Meaning the Romans had a crackdown on all the religious practices of the Jews, and that's why Bar Kochva fought them. So these were killed in defense of the religion. So that's why it was called Shmada. That was the eita that they gave. L'maisa, this girsa that says Shmada in the Shir Regain seems to be a faulty girsa. Later on, it was discovered that there's other nuschayos of the girsa of Shir Regain that don't have this word in their b'chlal. That seem to be the more accurate girsa. So probably the source is not even really a source. But there's more rayas and more kashas that they had on all different various nakudas in the Gemara. To me, it really seems like a theory that's born of the idea. They want to have this idea that this is why Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim were killed, and we'll make the information fit. Now, I want to just give a little bit of talk about Rabbi Akiva, his Talmidim, his life, and the tkufa that we're talking about, just to understand this better in context. Now, we know the din in Shulchan Aruch, as the Shulchan Aruch says, that during Sfiras HaOmer, for 33 days out of Sfiras HaOmer, we're makpid not to shave, not to listen to music, etc. Right? Now, how exactly do we get to that calculation of 33 days out of Sfiras HaOmer? So there's three shittas in the Rishonim how to get there. The two most common ones, and this the Be'er Halacha brings down in Simon Taf Tzadik Gimel. Be'er Halacha brings down the two most popular ones, and they are as follows. Shita number one is that they died for 34 days out of Sfira, because it says Kula Mesu Me Atzeres. Mi Pesachvad Atzeres, but elsewhere Chazal say ad Prois Atzeres, until the beginning of Atzeres. Now the season of Atzeres starts 16 days before Atzeres itself. So if you do 49 minus 16 should be 34. If it's not, then I'm getting the math off a drop. It should be 34. That's one way that the Rishonim calculate 34 days of dying. The dying didn't really go all the way to Shavuos. It stopped 15 days before Shavuos, when the dying stops. Pesach at the beginning, yeah. And that's one version. The second version the Biur Halacha brings is that they only died on days that weren't Shabbos and that would, Biur Halacha says the second one, they only died on, Shnia says, this is Taisvis Shita, that they only died on days, any day that we don't say Tachnon, they didn't die on. So Imkain Kishataytzi Shiva Simei Pesach, take out the 7 days of Pesach, V'oit Shisha Shabbosis, 6 Shabbosis, and Shnei Yom Rosh Chodesh, 2 days of Rosh Chodesh a year, V'yom Echad Rosh Chodesh Sivan. All those days you deduct them from the Cheshbon, you left only with 34 days of dying. So either way, we come to the conclusion that it should be. What do you say?
Didn't you say Tachman during Nisan back then?
No, we don't say Tachman Yom Tov.
Nisan.
No, Yom Tov. Oh yeah, Nisan they said. Yeah, they weren't Chasidish yet. Yeah, they weren't.
No one says
Yeah, they weren't Chasidish yet. Yeah, they said. So comes to this. You have two calculations. That's a good point. Two calculations of 34 days.
The second half, which.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
What about the Shlosh Me'akbala?
So that's it. Do we say Tachman Sheish Me'akbala?
No.
1 second. Shem Rosh Chodesh year. Yom Echad Rosh Chodesh Sivan. I'm not seeing that in the Cheshbon. Either way, this is the two most popular, most basic shittas that the Mishnah Berurah brings down, the Biur Halacha brings down. These come from Rishonim. They have these, and this is how we get to the calculation that makes it to halacha, that we keep 33 out of the days this year. Now, Lamaisa, according to this calculation, it should be 34 days that we keep, which is the minig of the Mechaber. Sfaradim Takasei, the Mechaber Paskins over here in Meforish, 34 days, which is very Hegioni, that makes a lot of sense. Looking at the Makairis, that makes a lot of sense. The Ramah says, over here in Sif Gimel, that the minig is, it's a base, the Ramah says, B'medinas Elu, in our locales, Einoig Kedvarav, El Mistakrim B'yom Lamed Gimel, we already shave and get haircuts on the 33rd day. We do a little extra simcha. That's what he's saying. Yeah, so this is the famous machlokes. It's fine. And the Ramah is quoting a Maril that says this. So this is the minig that became. Now these are the minhagim that are basically attached to Akiva's Talmidim. Now, so let's just I guess for the sake of shlemus over here, let's wind back a little bit. Why Rabbi Akiva is so consequential? Why, aside from the sheer number of his Talmidim who died, but why the destruction of Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva is so consequential, and why, according to the Pri Chadash and possibly the Arizal and others, the reason why we're really celebrating like BaOmer is because Rabbi Akiva got a second shot. So Rabbi Akiva's origin story is everybody's very familiar with that. I'm assuming based on the Gemara in Nedarim and the Gemara in Ksubis. Rabbi Akiva was an Amaretz who didn't know how to learn it all. The daughter of Kalba Sifua met him. She wanted to marry him. Her father said, "You're going to have no hanaf from me." He made a neder. Eventually, Rabbi Akiva goes to yeshiva. Right, this part everyone's very back with. He comes home in the middle. He hears her saying that Halavai should go back again. He does go back again, and he finally comes back home. The Gemara in Ksubas Daf Samach Beis says he comes back home with 24,000 Talmidim. There you see that same number again. He comes back with 24,000 Talmidim. The townsfolk, including his father-in-law, are mobbing this new rabbi who came to the city. They try to keep his wife away, and she says, "No, shaliva shalachem shalahi." Right? That's the famous line, song, quote, bumper sticker, whatever you want it to be. Shaliva shalachem shalahi. That's Rabbi Akiva's origin story. Now, interestingly, is Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara in Psachim tells us, "Kishahiyisi ama'aretz." He says, "When I was an ignoramus, I used to say, Im yitin li Talmud Chacham, if they'll give me a Talmud Chacham, anashchenu kichamar, I'll bite him like a donkey." And why like a donkey? The Gemara specifies. Because when a donkey bites, its jaw power is enough to crack bones, as opposed to other animals that can't actually give a fracture. So he was saying, I'll give a bite like, a proper bite that will give a fracture. So Taisvis, Afanart, and Ksubis also, points out that if you look at the Gemara in Ksubis, it says Kalba chose him because even though he wasn't a Talmid Chacham, she saw he was Tsanua Umayli. He had nice midas. He was Tsanua and had, elevated midas. This doesn't sound like someone who has elevated midas. So Taisvis, and it's Machlekes Rishonim, but Taisvis says that Rabbi Akiva this was a defense mechanism, a very psychological svara. He says Rabbi Akiva didn't hate Talmidei Chachamim. Rabbi Akiva at that point thought that Talmidei Chachamim hated him. So as a defense mechanism, he said, "You give me one of these Talmidei Chachamim and I'll bite him like a donkey." Not because he Batzim had any animus in his heart toward Talmidei Chachamim. He thought they didn't like him. So if someone doesn't like you, you get defensive. That's Taisvis' first out, which is a nice psychological observation. Other Rishonim, the Ran, the Shulchan Giborim, other Rishonim say that Rabbi Akiva had phases in his life. Rabbi Akiva Taka started all the way from the bottom as someone who was angry and violent enough to threaten to bite a Talmid Chacham and break his bones, and went all the way to become the undisputed Gadol Hadar of his entire generation and many generations before and after him. So, it's a true Baal Tshuva story, mamish, from zero to everything. That's what the other sheet in the Rishonim is. Now, Rabbi Akiva seems was a great teacher because he put together a tremendous yeshiva of 24,000 Talmidim. He brought them home, right? It was a big yeshiva. Now at some point, Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim all die. Probably, like the Gemara tells us, nothing to do with Bar Kochba revolt, which we'll talk about in a second, why it's even more problematic. Aside from the fact, and this I just want to, aside from the fact that it really seems to be connected to Pashas Gemara, there's even more details that are shver, and we'll get to them. But Rabbi Akiva loses all his Talmidim. The world was in a state of destruction. Why the world was in a state of destruction? I can't imagine that if Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 Talmidim, there was no other Tanam who had yeshivas, right? It wasn't a monopoly. There was other Tanam. Rabbi Akiva had what started off as a small outpost in Bnei Brak that grew into being, Mamish Panovich times 100, but it couldn't have been the only yeshiva. What does it mean, Ha'olam Shamim? So this leads us to the understanding of what Rabbi Akiva's role. Rabbi Akiva's role, I'll be the Sifrei Kabbalah, but really I'll be the Gemara. The Mekubalim talk about this, and other Chazals and Mashma like this. Rabbi Akiva was the second Moshe Rabbeinu. Not that he was a Gilgal of Moshe Rabbeinu, even though the Sifrei and Mekubalim say that also. That Rabbi Akiva had Mitzaitz of Moshe Rabbeinu. Rabbi Akiva was the second Moshe Rabbeinu. The Hainu Moshe Rabbeinu was the Moshe Torah. He gave Klal Yisrael Torah Shebachsav. That was Moshe Rabbeinu's job. He brought Torah from Har Sinai. He gave it to Klal Yisrael. And Rabbi Akiva's job was to give Torah Shebal Peh to Klal Yisrael. So his job was equally as important to Moshe Rabbeinu's job. Rabbi Akiva was occupied a tremendous spot. Ad Kedei Kach, there's a fascinating Gemara in Menachos. I don't know if the Elam is familiar with it. I'll just read it out a little bit. The Gemara in Menachos says something wild. The Gemara says as follows: when Moshe Rabbeinu was getting the Torah, it says he saw Hashem was being kaiser ksarim tagim. On the top of the Isis and Sefer Torah, certain Isis in the Sefer Torah, 7 I believe of the Isis and Sefer Torah have those like crowns, right, like the 3 crowns. So he saw Hakadosh Baruch Hu was doing this. So Moshe Rabbeinu asks Hashem, "Mima akav al yadcha?" Like what is this for? Meaning the Torah is enough complex with drushes and the Yud Gimel Midas and all the other ways and methodologies that we're going to have to build and everything out of the Torah. What's this? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, I want to read you the words. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, Amar Loi, Adam Echad Yesh, there's going to be a person, Sha'asad Liyas B'Seif Kamaderis, who's going to arise in many generations from now. Akiva ben Yosef Shmai. His name is Akiva ben Yosef. Sha'asad Lidrish al Kol Kutz V'Kutz Tile Tilin Shal Halachas. He's going to have the ability, these prodigal abilities to darshan on every one of these kutzin, tilim, reams and reams of halachas. Amr Lefanov, so Moshe Rabbeinu tells HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rebbeinu Shalom, Hareuli, please show him to me, I'd love to see him. Amr Lechazar Lacharecha. Hashem says, okay, go into the, go, turn around, whatever that means. I'm going to give you a vision now, you're going to be able to see your Akiva. It says, Chazar Lacharecha, Halach V'yashav B'Seif Shmei Neshuris. Moshe Rabbeinu went and found himself sitting, like a virtual reality, in the 8th row of Rabbi Akiva's shir. Now, I don't know, it must have had a lot of rows of Akiva Shir. We don't know if this is the 24,000 Tkufa, the later Tkufa, had a lot of rows. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have a clue what they were saying, which is a crazy thing to think. Moshe Rabbeinu sitting on Akiva Shir, he didn't understand what he's talking about. So, Tashash Koichen, Moshe Rabbeinu became weak. Like, what is this? Kivan Shigiyah L'Davar Echad, he heard in the Shir that Amrulei Talmidim, Rabbi Akiva set up a din, and Talmidim asked him, Rabbi, Minayin L'cha, where do you know this din from? Amrulahem, he told them, Halach L'Meshmi Sinai. This is Halach L'Meshmi Sinai. This is not, you can't, this is above reproach. You can't question this. So, Nisyash V'daitis. Moshe Rabbeinu he was calmed down. He felt better. Chazar Balafnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he returns in front of Hashem. Amar L'fanav Rebbeinu Shalom. Yesh L'cha Adam Kazev Atanais Torah Al Yadi. You have a person like this, like Akiva ben Yosef, who's coming up in generations, and you're giving the Torah through me? What a waste! Give it to Rabbi Akiva. He's much better than me. So, Amar Le'shtoi Kachal Machshava. Hashem tells him, no, this is what I want. Amar L'fanav Rebbeinu Shalom Heretuni Teirase Hereni Scharei. You showed me his Torah, now show me his reward. Look again. He saw them weighing out Rabbi Akiva's flesh like in a butcher shop, meaning brutally murdering Rabbi Akiva, like we know Rabbi Akiva was ultimately murdered. This is the Torah and this is the reward. This is what I want. Now there's so many things that are worth discussing in this Gemara that we're not going to go into now. Every step of this, Moshe Rabbeinu is feeling bad from Rabbi Akiva. Moshe Rabbeinu is feeling better from Yereg Alach L'Mishmi Sinai. Taka, what does it mean? Olav Machshava. What type of answer is that? Why was Rabbi Akiva? Why is that called Tzcharei? His reward to be killed in that manner. Meaning maybe it's a necessary. There's so many things to address in this Gemara. It's a fascinating. We're not going to go into that. The point that I just want to highlight from this Gemara is the role, the space that Rabbi Akiva occupies in Mesiras HaTorah. Rabbi Akiva is the second Moshe Rabbeinu, or in some contexts even the first Moshe Rabbeinu. The more, like, if you could imagine such a thing, even more consequential to the Mesiras HaTorah, to Klal Yisrael's Mesiras about the Torah that we have, than Moshe Rabbeinu. He single-handedly is the one who gave over Torah Shebal Peh to Gans Klal Yisrael. Now, this Torah Shebal Peh that he gave over was much more in the second cadre of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. The first Talmidim, and this is above our pay grade, but the Arizal explains this in Alpi Kabbalah, how the first Talmidim were attached to Rabbi Akiva's katnus, whatever that means, and they were not capable of giving over the vast magnitude of Rabbi Akiva's Torah that needed to be given over. But the second cadre of Talmidim, although they were smaller in number, were much more tzugepast, up either Sherish and Hashamas, Rabbi Akiva's godless, and they were able to give it over, whatever that means. But in any case, Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim that we said over here, I just want to read you. There's a Gemara. Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim that he had, there's 5 Talmidim, right, that we said over here. It's the Gemara over here in Sanhedrin says as follows: Am Rav Yochanan, Stam Masnisan, Reb Meir. A Stam mission that you find is Reb Meir Shita. Reb Meir, Talmud of Rabbi Akiva from the second batch. Stam Tesefta, Reb Nechemia, again, Talmud of Rabbi Akiva from the second batch. Stam Sifra, Reb Yehuda Bar Ilai, who is again a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva from the second batch. Stam Sifri, Reb Shimon ben Yochai, him we know, Talmud of Rabbi Akiva from the second batch. And Stam Seder Eilim is Reb Yossi Bar Chalafta, again, Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. The Kulam, Alibud Rabbi Akiva. They're all, and the way Rashi touches it, are based on Rabbi Akiva's learning. If you do a tally, I didn't, but someone else did, in Mishnayos, over 1,000 times, these 5 Manda Amrim are mentioned. Meaning, it's a crazy number. That's an incredible amount, and presuming that they're all Alibud Rabbi Akiva, and assuming that there are other Dairis of Tanaim who are Makabal from them, meaning the Mishnah has Tanaim from many Dairis, it's not only from one Dar, it means that Rabbi Akiva's saturation of the Mishnayos, his dominance in Teresh Balpeh, in giving over the Mishnayos is complete, meaning it's next level. It's 1,000 open, members from his immediate Talmidim, and many, many more from the next generation of Talmidim. It's all Alibud Rabbi Akiva. That's the whole. The Seder there says that when Rabbi came to be Masad of the Mishnah, he looked for everything Alibud Rabbi Akiva. It was all looking for the Mishnayos that came back Rabbi's many days later, for the Mishnayos to come from Rabbi Akiva. Now, Ad Kedei Kach, that Rabbi Akiva has this special role, this occupies this special place. There's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah in the Flamet Zayin and Tainus Daf Tes that says as follows. It says, not Daf Tes, I could be off, maybe Daf Yud Aleph. It says, Marukva Ekloi LeGinzak. Marukva came to the town of Ginzak. V'shaul, they asked him 3 shaylas. He didn't know the answers. And the Gemara proceeds to bring three shaylas. Now Rashi in Tainus, if you look at it, Rashi says, Is the Garsi Rabbi Akiva? There are those who say it's Rabbi Akiva Ekloi LeGinzak. But Rashi says it can't be because Rabbi Akiva would have known the answer. That's what Rashi says. It couldn't be Rabbi Akiva. It must be it's Marukva. Rabbi Akiva would have known the answer. Now Tosfos in Avodah Zarah and the Flamet Zayin brings this quote from Rashi that it can't be Rabbi Akiva because he would have known the answer, but he adds something that's just for emphasis, like a little exclamation mark. Tosfos says, Chas v'shalom shaloi yedeya. It can't be such a thing. Chas v'shalom that Rabbi Akiva wouldn't have known. Meaning the presumption of Tosfos and of Rashi is that Rabbi Akiva is so much the Baal HaMemra of Teresh Balpeh that it's not possible. There could have been shilas in rabbinic literature, and Rabbi Akiva didn't know the answer. It's impossible. Such a thing can't exist. Ad Kedei Kach, the Gemara says that the Gemara in Babasra Dafid Bey says that even though Nevuah is batal, but there still is a little bit of Nevuah that people could have. Why? One of the examples the Gemara uses is because sometimes someone could say a member and he could be mechavan to Rabbi Akiva, and that's impossible. Without it being some sort of Nevuah, you can't be mechavan to Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is this next level Meiser HaTorah of giving over the Torah to Klal Yisrael. So there's many more. I'm leaving a lot on the cutting board over here. There's many, many more. Now, Akapanim, this to me is the explanation of what the Arizal and the Pri Chadash and possibly the Ben Ish Chai are explaining, that the Simcha of BaOmer is not so much. I'll tell you something interesting that the Ben Ish Chai says. The Ben Ish Chai says that this that we go to Miron on BaOmer, he says, it's not because of Rav Shimon ben Yochai's yard side, or that's not the primary reason. We go there because Rav Shimon ben Yochai was a Talmud of Akiva. And this is the day of his Galas HaTorah. This is the day the Torah was revealed. Torah Shabbat, Torah Shabbat was revealed. He says, Memela, if you live in Tveria near Reb Meir, you should go there. And if you live near Rabbi Akiva's grave, you should go there. And if you live near Rabbi Yossi ben Chalat, you should go there. Go to any one of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. That's where we're going to celebrate Mesiras HaTorah. We're going to celebrate the Hisgalus of Torah Shabbat. Now, what's interesting is this is not what became. Today, the popular take is fakert, that BaOmer is the Matan Torah of Teresh Anister, of Rav Shimon ben Yochai's Torah, of Zoyar and Teresh Anister. Pnimi Torah. That's what BaOmer is the Matan Torah on. Not exactly like this, but I'm just fakert. I'm trying to show a different perspective that maybe is not so known today. Is this other perspective that really comes from the Arizal and the Pri Chadash and etc. that explores this. Now, just to jump back a little bit out of order here, but just to jump back to the theory that Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim were killed in battle. So we explained some of the problems, right? That it goes seemingly connected. The Gemara, Rav Shiri Gaon is not a great source. Additionally, Rav Hai Gaon, who's Rav Shiri Gaon's son, has a tshuva where they ask him about doing engagements during. It's a short tshuva, it's a few lines. Ask him about doing engagements during Sfiras Hayim. Rav Hai Gaon says we don't do engagements during Sfiras Hayim. You could do an engagement, just know chasanas and simchas. But even if you're asking, I would tell you not even to get engaged, because ben Pesach la'atzeres mesu shnayim as elf zugas Talmidim Akiva mipnei shalinagu kavod zelazeh. He brings the whole Gemara's quote because they weren't covered to each other. So Rav Haigain, who's Rav Shira's son, who would l'chayra be aware of his father's Messiah, to say this, makes no mention of it at all. Additionally, it's strange if Rav Shira Gaon was actually an alternate Messiah, different than the Gemara maybe. Like some wanted to say the Gemara had to censor itself because they were afraid of the Romans. And Rav Shira Gaon was like the oral tradition, like the real story, like the real story behind the Gemara. If that was the case, then why did nobody know it until him? Why does nobody know it after him until the 1800s? It's very strange. This Messiah just pops up once, like in the year 950, but like before and after, it's totally gone. It's a strange idea. Additionally, just one other kasha is that we know Rav Shimon Yochai is one of the Talmidim. It's a little bit nuanced, but Rav Shimon Yochai is one of the Talmidim who learned in the second batch, right? That's what it says. Now, there's a Gemara in Brachas that talks about a big machlekes that Rabbi Shua and Rav Gamliel had. Ultimately, Rav Gamliel is a little too harsh on Rabbi Shua, and they take him down from the Steller, and they appoint Elazar ben Azariah. We say this in the Haggadah, right? Harei Anika ben Shimon Shana, Elazar ben Azariah was only 18 years old, and his beard turned white. Now, there's a Mishnah in Maisris and a Yerushalmi that say that Elazar ben Azariah was once in the Beis HaMikdash to bring I forgot which one of the matanas. Now, if Elazar ben Azariah was 18 when the story happened, he lived right around that kufa. So let's say the Seder there says, I forgot which, not Seder. Let's say he was 3 to 5 years old at the time of the Beis HaMikdash's destruction. Okay, that's Elazar ben Azariah. Now, if you look at that story at the end of the Gemara that describes this whole big fight between Rav Gamliel and Rabbi Shua, Elazar ben Azariah is partaking in it, and Rabbi Akiva's role in it. It says, "Va'oisei Talmud." Who is that Talmud who sparked this whole configuration? Who is the one who went and asked Rav Gamliel Shaila, Rabbi Shua Shaila? Oisei Talmud is Rav Shimon ben Yochai. That's what it says. So it means Rav Shimon ben Yochai was already on the scene. He was already a Talmud in Beis Medrash, call it 15 years after the Churban. The Bar Kochba revolt only happened 52 years after the Churban. If it took till the Bar Kochba revolt for Akiva's first batch of Talmidim to be killed, and only then did he start learning with the second Talmidim, like the Gemara in Yevamos says Mashma, that would mean that Rav Shimon ben Yochai was like in his mid to late 60s already when he became a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, which, although is not impossible, is highly implausible. That someone who was in his 60s only then became a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. They were in yeshiva already together 45 years earlier, and it's highly implausible. And there's a bunch more of these, but it's highly implausible that additionally the Gemara tells us elsewhere that Rav Shimon ben Yochai learned by Rabbi Akiva for 13 years. The Bar Kochba revolt to Rabbi Akiva's death is only 2 years, so it'd have to be he started learning earlier. But again, everything basically boils down to the fact that it really does not jive with the Gemara. You can't really squeeze this theory into the Gemara. It's difficult to squeeze this theory into the Gemara. In any case, a little bit about Rabbi Akiva and his Talmidim.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.